Today I'd like to talk about the issue of Catholic politicians and receiving Holy Communion or being denied Holy Communion in certain circumstances. This issue has been discussed lately with regard to President Biden because of his position with regard to abortion. What I'd like to do in this presentation is take a look at a case that happened already with regard to President Biden when he was not president, when he was running for office. And this happened on Sunday, October 27th in 2019. And it happened at the 9 a.m. Mass at St. Anthony's Church in Florence, South Carolina. And the presider there was Father Robert Morey. Father Morey revealed this to a reporter from the Florence Morning News who questioned him about the incident. He revealed that he denied the candidate Biden, Holy Communion. Well, let's ask some questions about that. What could possibly justify denying someone Holy Communion? Why did this happen? And should it happen on a more widespread basis, as some have suggested, with regard to Catholic politicians in general? Two arguments have been advanced to back up this action. And the two arguments come from the first from Canon 915 of the Code of Canon Law, and the second is a memo that was written in 2004 by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later on became Pope Benedict XVI, is now an emeritus pope, when he served as prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And his memo was entitled Worthiness to Receive Holy Communion, General Principles. We'll take a look at both of these and see how it applied in that situation and how it could apply in a more general way. What about this canon, Canon 915? Canon 915 states that communion should not be given basically to two groups of people. The first are those who are excommunicated or interdicted. And the second, those who are obstinately persist in manifest grave sin. They just are grave sinners, and they persist in the grave sin, and they show no desire to convert or turn away from the grave sin. They should not be given Holy Communion. Because again, this could lead, the worry is, of course, the concern to a sacrilege, to not valuing Holy Communion for the beautiful sacrament it is, the sacrament of the body and blood of Jesus. Now, would this particular canon apply to Joe Biden in that situation and in subsequent situations in his life? The sin in question, of course, would be Mr. Biden's position of support and his voting record for abortion rights. Is this, first of all, a grave sin? And how do we judge this, if it's a grave sin or not? Mr. Biden has consistently said that he is against abortion personally. His position is that the right to an abortion is now part of the law of the United States after the decision of the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade, in that case that was decided in 1973. Since it is the current law of the land, even though he does not personally approve of abortion, he is obligated to make sure that women have access to the rights that are embodied in this decision. It's a decision, I disagree with it, but it is the law of the land. I personally feel differently, but since it has been decided, it's the law of the land. As a politician, I must facilitate that law for women who want to take advantage of that right that was embodied in that law, in that particular decision. Now, does this position constitute a grave sin, a sin that would exclude one from Holy Communion? Well, the three conditions for a grave sin are, number one, there must be an object of evil. Number two, we must give it sufficient reflection. And number three, there must be a full, complete consent of the will. Abortion is an object of evil. The question in dispute would be, does legislation that allows for abortion qualify as an objective evil? If abortion isn't evil, does the legislation also qualify as an objective evil? If I am voting for a bill that facilitates and funds this constitutional right, am I promoting an objective evil? Would I therefore be an instrumental cause of this objective evil? As a legislator, I take a vow to uphold the Constitution. The Supreme Court has the ultimate authority, legal authority, in the United States to interpret the Constitution. I might personally disagree with a particular decision, but I have an obligation to make sure that that decision is carried out. In this case, my obligation would be to make sure that women have access to abortion services, even though I am opposed to abortion on religious grounds. My religion says it's an objective evil. I believe it's an objective evil. I believe in my faith. So that's my position. It is an objective evil. But as a legislature, I have the following options. What do I do as a legislator to handle this situation? Number one, I can refuse to vote. I can cast what we call an NV, a no vote, on all matters that pertain to abortion funding as just a matter of conscience. I can say, I'm not going to cast any votes. Abortion is wrong. I'm not going to vote for it. Secondly, I can vote against all funding of abortion because I am personally opposed to it. It is the law of the land, but I am personally opposed. Therefore, I am not going to vote at all for the least bit of funding for it. Thirdly, I can vote for abortion funding because it has been determined to be in accordance with the Constitution, and I am sworn to uphold the Constitution. And so I have to follow this, even though personally I disagree with it. Fourth, I can resign from the legislature. I can say, I don't want to have anything to do with this. It's a terrible situation. I am going to resign over this issue of abortion. In returning to our three conditions for a serious or grave sin, what we call a mortal sin, I would presume that a conscientious legislator has given the funding bills with regard to abortion sufficient reflection. It is such a controversial issue, talked about all the time, widely discussed, that would seem obvious that the legislator has reflected on it. When a vote is cast, the presumption would also be that I have given full consent of the will. An exception, of course, would be where a legislator is forced to vote for a particular piece of legislation under a serious threat to her or his life. You don't vote for it, I'm going to kill you. Well, you're not giving then full consent of the will, obviously. But this does not apply to votes with regard to abortion funding in our present context. If I vote for abortion funding in this situation, I have to be morally convinced that I am voting for an objective evil, for it to be a grave sin for me. A person can counter this by saying to such a legislator that her or his conscience was not properly formed on this issue because abortion is an objective evil. The person who engages in abortion is ending a life. Mr. Biden has stated that he personally believes this, and that he accepts the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to abortion. He also believes that he doesn't have a right to force his belief on others who might disagree with his religious convictions on this matter. He is not contradicting the teaching of the Catholic Church, nor is he refuting it in any way. His position is that as a legislator in a pluralistic society, he has to be careful in imposing his deeply held religious convictions on others. There are those who would disagree with this position and hold that since this is an objective moral truth, abortion can never be accepted or justified by anyone under any circumstance whatsoever. It is an objective truth. It must be accepted by everyone. Those who engage in an abortion, support an abortion, or facilitate one, or try to justify abortion as a legitimate right for a woman, they are misguided. They totally have missed the picture. They don't understand that this is an objective truth, that this is a murder. Since there are strong opinions on both sides of this issue, and since the United States of America is a pluralistic nation with many religious and many moral traditions, the argument that voting for funding for abortion, which has been determined to be a constitutionally guaranteed right, constitutes a grave sin is really not a strong argument. A further complication would be even if one would accept the line of reasoning that it is a grave sin, as some have accepted, and obviously Father Morey accepted that in his action with regard to then Mr. Biden, one would still face the problem of the individual conscience. If Mr. Biden does not consider this to be a grave sin, does Father Morey have the right to override Mr. Biden's conscience? Catholic moral theology has consistently taught about the supremacy of the individual conscience. We see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 1800. In this case, Mr. Biden's conscience would trump Father Morey's concern. Now let's look at that second writing that has been used to justify this position of denying Holy Communion. And that would be the memo of Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, the worthiness to receive Holy Communion general principles. The memo calls for the pastor to meet with a Catholic politician who has consistently campaigned for permissive abortion and euthanasia and voted for both, and instruct him about the Church's teaching. It would seem, however, in this case, that Mr. Biden is aware of the Church's teaching and fully accepts it. Abortion is an objective evil. It's wrong. The issue is not about what the Church teaches, but the right to abortion that is found in the Constitution. The memo also calls for the pastor to inform her or him that she or he should not come to Holy Communion until she or he brings to an end the objective situation of sin. In this case, however, Mr. Biden fully accepts the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to abortion. Is the objective situation of sin found in his voting to fund a right that is found in the Constitution? Can a Catholic be against abortion and yet supportive of the Constitution and the right that it embodies? If a Catholic politician votes to fund that right, has she or he committed a grave sin because they're voting to fund something that the Constitution says is a right for women? Again, even though we disagree with that. Again, we find this Catholic politician is in the same situation that was outlined above. Cardinal Ratzinger might decide that Mr. Biden or any Catholic politician with similar sentiments has committed a grave sin, but does that opinion override the conscience of Mr. Biden? The moral teaching of the Catholic Church is that it does not. Cardinal Ratzinger and Father Morey would both hold that Mr. Biden has committed a grave sin by voting for funding for abortions and publicly stating that he is in favor of such funding. Mr. Biden certainly has a moral obligation to prayerfully reflect on that opinion. It's part of forming his conscience. There's an opinion out there that says you should not vote for this funding. You're facilitating a moral evil. And as a good Catholic, you certainly should reflect on that prayerfully. Pray about it and determine, what God is telling you in your conscience in terms of how you should vote and what you should do. Cardinal Ratzinger holds in his memo that this is not a judgment on the subjective guilt of the Catholic politician who votes for funding of abortion. So we are not making a determination in terms of subjective guilt. The concern rather is the person's public unworthiness to receive Holy Communion due to an objective situation of sin. This, of course, involves an obvious contradiction. If the person has no subjective guilt, they're always free to receive Holy Communion. The public unworthiness involves a judgment that I cannot place on an individual, because in doing that, I would be replacing the conscience of the person as to her or his worthiness to receive Holy Communion with my own conscience. Again, as in the case with Father Maury, I'd be saying my conscience, my determination, trumps your conscience. In that situation, I would be saying that this person's conscience is not adequate to make the decision about her or his worthiness to receive Holy Communion. I would, in essence, be saying to them that even though you do not feel that you have committed a sin by voting to fund the constitutional right of abortion as determined by the Supreme Court, I feel that it is an objective evil, and therefore I am replacing your inferior conscience with my more rightly and correctly formed conscience. My correctly formed conscience is objectively true, and this objectively true conscience allows me to deny you access to Holy Communion. This has never been the position of the Catholic Church, nor is it correct Catholic moral theology. Now, is there any situation where Holy Communion could be denied to a Catholic politician who advocates for abortion? There is, of course, such a situation, and it is an obvious one. I could state that I am a Catholic and that I am opposed to the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to abortion. I could state that I believe this teaching to be incorrect, even though I accept the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to other matters, and that I consider myself to be a Catholic. And that would be, for example, the case of Janice Gleason from San Diego in 1975, who stated that she was opposed to the teaching of the Catholic Church on abortion, and she was excommunicated and forbidden to receive communion. The problem here is different than the Catholic politician who states that she or he is personally opposed to abortion, accepts the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to abortion, and yet is following the settled constitutional legal opinion with regard to abortion as determined by the Supreme Court. And again, we can question that opinion and say, I disagree with it, it's not a good opinion, it should be changed, but now, of course, it is the present opinion. The question then becomes why you would not follow the same logic with regard to conscience. The difference would be in the public scandal and the moral confusion that would follow. Both politicians would be following their consciences, but the politician who is opposed to the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to abortion has placed herself or himself outside the Church by embracing that position. Denying such a person Holy Communion is an acknowledgement of their status as someone who is not in communion with the teachings of the Church. Now, another consideration with regard to this development, in terms of Father Maury, is the question people ask, well, was Father Maury justified in disclosing his action to a representative of the public media? One could rightly question the decision of Father Maury to discuss this matter with the journalist. If this is a personal matter between Father Maury and Mr. Biden, was it proper to communicate that to a journalist? Father Maury's decision could be defended, obviously, by saying that Mr. Biden presented himself for Holy Communion in a public way, and therefore communicating that in a public forum, like a newspaper, was appropriate. It would seem, however, that respect for the dignity of the individual would lead one to leave this matter between Father Maury and Mr. Biden, and to say when a journalist would inquire, well, that's a personal matter. Now, many people raise the analogy of the New Orleans precedent, a situation that happened in New Orleans under Archbishop Rommel. Archbishop Rommel used the threat of excommunication in 1956 against the person who founded a group called the Association of Catholic Laymen in New Orleans. And basically a racist group, these Catholic laymen, were saying, we don't want to integrate with those from the inferior black race. Um, the Archbishop argued for integration and pushed for integration of Catholic parishes and schools. This was after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, and thus it was the law in our country. Just like, again, for us as Catholics, we would say, unfortunately, Roe versus Wade is the law of the land. Eventually, 3 of the Catholic lay leaders of the anti-integration movement were excommunicated. And people have said, well, they were excommunicated, they were denied communion. We can do the same with Catholic politicians today. This helped with the effort to integrate the Catholic schools in New Orleans. They were integrated 2 years after the public schools were integrated there. The problem with this analogy, of course, is that Mr. Biden is not denying a teaching of the Catholic Church, as those laymen denied the teaching of the Church with regard to the equality of all people of every race. He is making a prudential judgment with regard to the funding of a constitutional right. His position is developed out of a caution in imposing his Catholic faith and morality on others. The Catholic lay leaders in New Orleans at that time were publicly denying a Catholic moral teaching about the equality of the races. The better analogy to the New Orleans situation would be the Gleason case in San Diego. Now, some people then raise the issue in terms of, well, where would this kind of thing lead us? This teaching with regard to excluding from Holy Communion. There are some who are in agreement, obviously, with the actions of Father Maury, and some want this embodied in a more formal way with regard to President Biden and other Catholic politicians today, and they want a more general thing to be published. And what would be the implications, though, of such a policy? Now, let's ask, for example, well, who else should we exclude in terms of this? Should, for example, Justice Anton Scalia have been excluded from Holy Communion when he publicly disagreed with the teaching of Pope John Paul II and the Catechism of the Catholic Church with regard to capital punishment? He said it in a public lecture. He said it's wrong. He said we should have capital punishment. And he disagreed with the Pope and with the Catechism. Should he have been excluded? Some have raised the argument with regard to Attorney General William Barr, a prominent Catholic who embraces capital punishment and who actually facilitated, as Attorney General, the execution of several individuals. Another argument is raised about William Buckley, the famous author. Should he have been excluded when he publicly disagreed with the encyclical letter of Pope John XXIII, Mater et Magistra, which said the Pope is wrong in his criticisms of capitalism? Should those who advocate for more funding for nuclear weapons and less for the hungry, should they be excluded? Well, they're advocating for nuclear weapons and people are starving to death. Should they be excluded because they're really not showing compassion for those who are starving? They're putting money into nuclear weapons, and people are dying. Should there be a universal policy on such exclusions, or should the matter be left up to individual priests, deacons, and ministers of the Eucharist? Should there be a general policy, or should an individual priest like Father Maury have that discretion? That's a legitimate question. Should there be an appeal process for a Catholic who is denied Holy Communion? Should we set something up and say, well, I can appeal that decision and I would like to receive communion? Should there be a special Vatican dicastery overseeing these situations? And which dicastery should it be, and how should that be handled? What about a situation in which a bishop or diocese calls for an exclusion, an individual priest, deacon, or extraordinary minister of the Eucharist does not agree with and does not follow the wishes of the bishop? The bishop says you can't give communion to this politician. And the bishop and the deacon says, forget about that. I'm going to give it to him. Well, what happens then? What's the discipline? So again, a lot of this certainly would have to be thought out, this type of policy situation. This is an action, denying Holy Communion to politicians, which raises a lot of questions and unfortunately confirms suspicions that the Catholic Church is concerned primarily with abortion and not the full range of life issues. Abortion is an object of moral evil, and we are all obligated to assist those who are making this difficult personal decision. Assist them in prayer, counseling, financial support are certainly called for, and we have to help them to see the importance of embracing life as Catholics. Advocating for particular laws and restrictions will remain a matter of debate and prudential judgment. So, should we have this law? Should we have that law? What should we do about it? Maybe this law is good, this law is bad, and we go back and forth and we discuss that. And we try to come to a way forward. It would seem to me that the sacramental life of the Catholic Church is really not the proper locus for this debate. The sacramental life of the Church is important, and it's crucial for us as Catholics. But to make this the area where we have the debate, is that a good thing going forward?